My son filed for guardianship to prove I had lost my mind. He called me confused, unstable, said I needed help. But he forgot I used to run a hospital unit and signed every legal paper that kept patients alive. I sat in silence, not because I was weak, but because I was preparing. What happens when the judge reads my test results out loud and his plan starts to fall apart? That morning, I opened my front door expecting nothing more than a quiet walk to the mailbox. Instead, a stranger in a navy windbreaker handed me a thick envelope and said my name in full. Then he walked away like it was just another task on his list. I held the envelope heavy and official, like it was vibrating in my hand. Inside a court summons. My son, Jason Langston, had filed a petition to become my legal guardian. He claimed I was no longer mentally competent to manage my life or my finances. I had to reread it 3 times before it made any sense. The language was cold and clinical. Cognitive decline, erratic behavior, medical vulnerability. His signature was on every page. I sat at the kitchen table, letting the pages fan out like a deck of cards. The silence in the house pressed against me. I used to love this house. Every corner held some memory. Now the walls felt like they were listening. Jason had been distant lately, but this was something else. We had not argued. I had no accident, no diagnosis, nothing that would suggest I was losing my mind. But here I was being summoned to court as if I were a danger to myself. I thought about the last conversation we had. He told me I should consider taking it easy and letting someone else handle things. I laughed it off, thinking he was just being concerned. Turns out that was a warning, or a test run. The petition listed every asset I owned: the house, my retirement account, my late husband's investment portfolio. Jason knew it all, and now he wanted control. What hurt wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way he wrapped it in concern, like he was doing this out of love. I raised that boy alone after my husband passed. I worked 30 years as a lead administrator in a county hospital. I handled surgeries, end-of-life care decisions, entire budgets. I held hands of patients when their families could not. But now, at 73, my own son claimed I could not even be trusted with my checkbook. I felt it in my chest, a heaviness that wouldn't lift. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat there. The tea I made earlier had gone cold. I picked up the cup, but I didn't drink it. My hands were steady, even if my heart was not. If you've ever had someone you love decide you're no longer useful, no longer trustworthy, then maybe you know this feeling too. Like standing in your own home but somehow no longer belonging there. I folded the court papers slowly as if touching them too fast might cut me. So this was how it began. And I had no idea yet how far he was willing to go. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing Jason's name in bold ink across those court papers, like it didn't belong to the boy I once bathed in a kitchen sink. I lay there listening to the ticking of the old wall clock, the one he used to stop just so I'd notice him. By morning, I stopped trying to rest. I brewed coffee instead. As I stirred, the cream in my hands moved on their own, but my thoughts were elsewhere. They drifted back, not to the Jason I had now, but to the child I once knew. When my husband Carl passed away unexpectedly, Jason was only 16. Grief swallowed him whole, but I held on to him tighter than ever. I went back to work full-time at the hospital and took on every extra shift I could find. I ran the community outreach programs, the grant applications, the intern rotations. I kept our home, paid every bill, and still made time to drive him to debate team tournaments across the state. I didn't remarry, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't want Jason to feel pushed aside. I thought my sacrifices would speak for themselves. I thought love, when lived fully, didn't need to be spelled out. When he turned 30, Jason wanted to leave his job in public health to start a real estate venture. He came to me with plans, blueprints, glossy booklets printed at Kinko's. He needed capital. I hesitated, but he said it was his dream. So I offered up my paid-off house as collateral. That house was my sanctuary, but I believed in him more than bricks and mortar. The years passed. His projects grew. He sent fewer updates. I brushed it off as busy adult life. I told myself that was a good thing, a sign he didn't need me to hold his hand anymore. But something changed around the time he married his second wife. He became polished, more guarded. Phone calls turned into brief text messages. Holidays became optional. Still, I told myself to respect his boundaries. I tried to be supportive without hovering. Now, reading through his petition again, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The list of assets he filed wasn't just accurate. It was detailed down to account numbers and estimated values. He had access to things I hadn't discussed with him in years. That meant he'd been watching quietly, collecting, planning. I opened the locked drawer in my writing desk. Inside was Carl's old notebook. He used it for financial notes, passwords, emergency contacts. On the last page in his handwriting was a simple line he once told me after a difficult week in hospice care. If someone ever tries to take your voice, write your truth before they rewrite it for you. I pressed my palm against that page like I was reaching back in time. Jason hadn't just taken a legal step. He had crossed a line I never thought he would. And now, for the first time in my life as a mother, I didn't feel the urge to protect him. I felt the need to protect myself. I called Jason that afternoon. My hands were steady when I dialed, though my breath caught once or twice. He picked up after 3 rings. His voice was smooth, too smooth, like a man who had already practiced what to say. He said he was just trying to help me, that he had noticed changes in me over the past few months, that I had seemed confused, distracted. He used words that didn't match reality, but sounded just clinical enough to sound legitimate. Then, as if to soften the blow, he reminded me how hard it had been watching his father's decline. He didn't say it outright, but the implication hung there. He was comparing me to Carl in his final days. I didn't argue. I just listened. I knew whatever I said now would be twisted, catalogued, and repeated in court, so I let him talk. When he realized I wasn't rising to it, he went quiet. Then he said something that told me everything I needed to know. His tone dropped just a little. He said it was probably for the best if I let the lawyers handle things moving forward, that it would get complicated. He said it would all go smoother if I just signed what they sent. Then he hung up. I sat still, phone in my hand, and let the silence expand. That night I received a voicemail from someone named Mark Atwood. He introduced himself as Jason's legal representative and said he would be following up with me personally to ease the transition of guardianship responsibilities. His voice was polished sharp, the kind you hear on a commercial selling security systems. The message ended with a warning dressed as kindness. He said if I refused to engage in the process, it might reflect poorly on me in court. I saved the message and called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year, Lucinda. She and I used to work together at the hospital. She had gone on to become a private consultant in elder care law after retirement. I told her everything, not just the legal part, but the feeling. The part that told me this wasn't about concern, this was about control. Lucinda asked for a scanned copy of the petition and the list of assets. She asked for my medical history, any evaluations, any records that showed mental clarity. She wasn't casual about it. Her tone shifted into something precise, like she was back in the courtroom herself. 2 hours later, she called me back. There were 2 documents Jason had attached to the petition. One was a signed declaration from a family physician saying I had demonstrated signs of forgetfulness during a recent visit. The other was a brief, notarized statement from a neighbor claiming I had left the stove on twice in the last 6 months. I hadn't visited that doctor in over 2 years, and that neighbor had moved away last winter. Lucinda asked me not to panic. She said we would proceed carefully, step by step. The next morning, she arranged for an independent forensic psychologist to conduct a full cognitive and emotional competency evaluation. Not just a quick screen, but a court-admissible, in-depth review with documentation video and written reports. It would be impartial and comprehensive. Then she made a second suggestion. She told me to freeze all access to my financial accounts until the evaluation was complete and the court reviewed my status. She gave me the name of a bank manager who worked discreetly with elderly clients in crisis. I took a cab into town that day, holding Carl's notebook in one hand and a list of account numbers in the other. It wasn't fear that drove me. It was clarity. Not the panicked kind that makes people act out. The cold, anchored kind that settles in when you know something is deeply wrong, and you know you cannot wait any longer. The office was on the third floor of a plain building with frosted glass windows and a buzzer entry. Nothing fancy, but everything about it felt clinical. Clean, organized, quiet. I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching the envelope Lucinda had prepared with my medical history ID and a handwritten list of every medication I had taken in the last 5 years. The psychologist's name was Dr. Evan Lawton, mid-40s, quiet voice eyes that watched without rushing. He didn't treat me like a patient. He treated me like someone whose story he needed to understand. The evaluation was not what I expected. It wasn't just a memory test or a few silly questions. It was long, thoughtful, structured. He asked about my daily routine, my financial responsibilities, how I made decisions. Then came the puzzles, the verbal reasoning, and the questions about current events and personal history. He tested my short-term recall reaction time and how I processed abstract ideas. It was exhausting, but I didn't stumble. What stayed with me most wasn't the test, though. It was the moment he asked me to describe my relationship with my son. I paused, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew too much. I told him the truth, that Jason used to be kind, that he was funny, sharp, full of promise, that he grieved hard when Carl died, that somewhere along the way, something hardened in him. Dr. Lawton listened without interruption. He made a few notes, but mostly let the silence do its work. At the end of the session, he said he would compile the full report with transcripts and analysis and submit it directly to the court as Lucinda requested. I asked for nothing special. I didn't want favor. I wanted clarity, truth without varnish. That evening, I took the long route home. I drove past the old church where Carl and I were married, the diner we used to take Jason to after Little League games, the library where I once led community health seminars. All of it still there, frozen in time. Yet I was the one being questioned for stability. When I got home, the lights on the porch had gone out. The motion sensor must have failed again. I stood there with my keys looking at my own front door like a stranger. Inside, I put the kettle on and stood at the counter thinking about what came next. The report would take 3 to 5 business days. In the meantime, Lucinda had me log all account activity, cancel automatic payments, and stop any non-essential spending. If Jason had tried to tap into anything even indirectly, we would know. The next day, she forwarded a legal copy of the power of attorney form Jason had filed months ago. I had no memory of signing it. The signature was shaky, not mine. The date placed it during a week I was in the hospital for a minor outpatient procedure. He had used that window to slip something through, or someone had. Lucinda contacted a handwriting expert immediately, quietly. No press, no noise. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the confused old woman Jason thought I was. I was still the same woman who once negotiated end-of-life care with angry sons and daughters in hospital rooms, who had delivered bad news to families with nothing but compassion and resolve. And now I was the one protecting myself, not with anger, but with evidence, with truth, with patience. What Jason started as a legal maneuver was becoming something else entirely, a slow, careful war. 3 days later, the report arrived. Lucinda called just after 8. I was sitting at the kitchen table organizing old tax returns and medical receipts into tidy piles. My eyes were dry, my hands steady. When I heard her voice, there was no panic in it, no urgency, just certainty. The report was clear. Dr. Lawton had outlined every segment of the evaluation in clinical, deliberate language. His findings left no room for misinterpretation. Cognitive function intact, memory retention above average for age, judgment and decision-making, consistent, reasoned, and independent. His final line stood out like a bold underline. No evidence of diminished capacity, no grounds for legal guardianship. I leaned back in my chair. The weight didn't leave me, but it shifted, from doubt to direction. Lucinda had already submitted the report to the court clerk. A copy was sent to Jason's legal counsel, and another one to the presiding judge. There would be a hearing scheduled to review the matter formally. Until then, the case was frozen. Jason could not proceed with any financial or legal decision on my behalf. But it wasn't over. That afternoon, Lucinda met me at the house. She brought a small black folder with her thick with photocopies. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee while she laid out documents across the kitchen counter like puzzle pieces. At the center was the forged power of attorney. The handwriting analyst's report had come in. It stated with professional certainty that the signature was not mine. Stroke pressure letter form, pen angle, all inconsistent. Furthermore, the date on the document had metadata from the scan that placed the file's creation at Jason's firm, not a notary office. Lucinda also pulled phone records from that week. Jason had placed several calls to a local courier service and a mobile notary, but none of them had my address listed in their delivery logs. In short, there was no verification chain, no legal witness, just a PDF document submitted quietly and filed under assumptions. I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder, cleaner, the kind of clarity that comes when the facts speak louder than emotion. Lucinda recommended we request a formal fraud investigation, not out of spite, not for revenge, but because legal boundaries had been crossed, rights had been threatened, trust had been violated. I nodded, just once, and that was enough. The next step was to notify the bank. My accounts were still secure, but Jason had attempted to reset my online access through an email tied to his firm. The bank flagged it as suspicious, but never informed me because they had assumed the original power of attorney was legitimate. That would change now. I signed a formal affidavit, and Lucinda submitted a petition to void the fraudulent POA and request an emergency injunction to prevent Jason or any third party from accessing my financial information until the case was resolved. By the end of that day, I had spoken to 3 financial advisors, updated all security protocols, and changed every password on every device. I even replaced my cell phone. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood now that Jason had prepared this for months. Quietly, strategically, piece by piece. But what he never anticipated was that I would fight back, not with noise, but with process. Not with guilt, but with quiet strength. I stood at the window as Lucinda left her car, turning out of the driveway. The sun had dipped low, brushing the trees with that golden haze that only lasts a few minutes. And in that moment, I knew. This was no longer about protecting what I had. It was about reclaiming who I was. The court date was set for a Thursday morning, 2 weeks from the day I received the evaluation results. I circled it on the calendar in red pen, not to mark it as a battle, but as a turning point, one I knew I wouldn't walk into blind. Lucinda spent the days leading up to it preparing the case file, but she also prepared me. She went over everything I might be asked how to respond without defensiveness, how to stay calm, even if Jason's team tried to rattle me. I listened, absorbed, and practiced, not because I feared them, but because I wanted my presence to speak as clearly as my words. That Tuesday, a packet arrived at my door. Thick manila envelope. Inside was Jason's formal response to the evaluation report. 8 pages of polite, rehearsed language questioning the legitimacy of Dr. Lawton's methods, and subtly implying that I might have performed well due to unrealistic testing conditions or coaching. He didn't accuse Lucinda by name, but the insinuation was there. At the end of the letter, he requested a second court-appointed evaluation. Lucinda read it twice before saying anything. She didn't get angry. Instead, she smiled, just slightly. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up 3 articles published by Dr. Lawton in peer-reviewed medical journals. One of them had been cited in multiple state rulings. His credentials were airtight. She filed a motion that afternoon to submit the analyst's report on the forged power of attorney. A second motion followed one to strike Jason's new petition on the grounds of manipulation and delay. She added attachments, phone records, bank security logs, the email trail where Jason had attempted to reset my login. Each line was factual, each exhibit verified. There was no need to embellish. The day before the hearing, I received a text from Jason. It was short. It said he hoped we could still talk after all this, that he had only wanted what was best for me. There was no apology, no responsibility, just a vague gesture like he wanted to rewrite the script before the final act. I didn't respond. That night I took out Carl's notebook again. I opened it to the last page. The handwriting was fading now, but the words were still there. Write your truth before they rewrite it for you. The next morning I arrived at the courthouse in a navy blazer and low heels. Nothing extravagant, just enough to show I had come prepared. Lucinda met me at the steps with a file box and a quiet nod. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Just a judge, a clerk, 2 attorneys, and a few rows of benches. Jason sat on the left side of the room with his lawyer. He looked surprised when he saw me. Not because I was there, but because I looked calm, steady. The judge entered, and everything began. Lucinda presented our case with clarity, moving through the evidence step by step. The evaluation, the forged signature, the bank flag, the attempted email breach. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She simply let the facts stand on their own. Jason's lawyer tried to counter. He questioned motive, suggested stress on my part, implied overprotection from Lucinda. But it didn't land. The judge interrupted once to ask why Jason hadn't disclosed the prior attempt to gain financial access. His lawyer fumbled. By the end of the hearing, the judge said he would issue a ruling within the week. But I already knew. I had taken the stand, not to beg, not to plead, but to show who I still was, and who I had always been. 5 days after the hearing, the ruling arrived in a sealed envelope delivered by certified mail. The weight of it felt heavier than paper. I sat down at the dining table and opened it slowly, sliding the pages out like they might cut if handled too fast. The court ruled in my favor. The judge had reviewed the full psychological evaluation, the fraud reports, the forensic handwriting analysis, and all supporting documents. His language was formal, but his meaning was unmistakable. There was no evidence that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. The petition for guardianship was denied permanently. Furthermore, he referred Jason's forged power of attorney to the district attorney for further investigation. My guardianship rights were affirmed. Jason was barred from initiating any future legal or financial claims on my behalf without explicit written permission, verified by two separate legal witnesses. He had lost more than the case. He had lost the court's trust. I placed the decision letter beside Carl's notebook on the table and sat in silence. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Lucinda and I had one final meeting scheduled with an estate attorney. We met in a modest office on the second floor of a red brick building that smelled faintly of cedar and copy toner. The attorney's name was Ms. Fernley, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and a sharp, direct tone. I handed her my existing will and the handwritten note Carl had left me years ago. We discussed the full scope of my estate, which included not just the house and retirement accounts, but also a community health fund. Carl and I had quietly built over the years through small investments. For years, that fund had been earmarked for Jason. We had hoped he would grow into the kind of man who would use it to build something lasting. But hope without responsibility becomes fantasy. Lucinda had already drafted a revised structure. Together with Ms. Fernley, we rewrote everything. The new will removed Jason entirely from inheritance, except for a single clause acknowledging that he had once been named but had forfeited that right through breach of fiduciary trust. His name remained on paper only to highlight what had been lost. Instead, the estate would be divided among several causes: a scholarship program for older women returning to school, a legal support network for elder protection cases, and a portion reserved for a foundation. Carl had once dreamed of establishing a mobile community clinic for underinsured rural towns. That night, I stood on my back porch, watching the wind move through the old pine trees. I thought about the years I had spent wondering whether I had been too soft with Jason, too patient, too willing to explain his behavior as stress or grief. But I no longer questioned myself. I had believed in the best of him. That had been my truth. But when the truth changed, I adapted. I acted. I protected myself with the same care I had once poured into him. 3 days later, Jason sent one final letter. It was handwritten. No envelope, just folded into the mailbox flap like an apology too proud to kneel. He said he didn't understand how it had all gone so far, that he never meant for it to hurt me, that he had only been trying to make sure things were handled right. But intentions don't excuse impact, and love doesn't erase harm. I didn't write back. Some bridges don't burn all at once. They rot quietly, one board at a time, until you step out and fall straight through. By the time the ruling came, my feet were already on solid ground again, and I had no intention of walking back. 2 weeks after the final ruling, I began the process of closing accounts and consolidating everything into a private family trust. Not for Jason, not for any future heir, for clarity, for protection, for peace. Lucinda arranged the legal paperwork and worked with Ms. Fernley to establish the trust's core structure. The assets were no longer in my name directly. They were protected behind a wall of carefully defined conditions. No single person, no outside relative, no persuasive voice at a dinner table would ever be able to alter what I had written in clarity. I didn't talk about it. I didn't boast. I just moved through the days quietly making calls, signing papers, closing doors behind me. Then came the dinner invitation. It arrived by email. From Jason's wife, Lila. She wrote that it had been a long time since we sat down as a family, that the past few months had been difficult on everyone. She suggested we meet for a small reconciliation meal at their home. No mention of the guardianship case, no mention of the forged power of attorney or the court's decision. Just a dinner. Lucinda read the message over my shoulder. She didn't say yes or no. She simply said if I chose to go, I should bring someone. Not for safety, for witness. I thought about it for a full day before responding. Then I sent back a single line. I would come. and I would bring dessert. I arrived at their house with a lemon tart and a notebook in my purse. The table was already set when I entered. Jason greeted me like nothing had happened, like we had simply skipped a few holidays and now things could slide back into place. Lila smiled a little too wide and kept brushing invisible crumbs from the counter. I sat, I ate, I listened. They talked about their garden, about Lila's sister visiting from Oregon, about Jason's law firm merging with a larger firm. They didn't ask about my health or the hearing or how it felt to be accused of losing my mind, and I let the silence hold that weight. Halfway through dessert, Jason finally said he hoped the new legal arrangements wouldn't complicate anything, that we were all still family. I nodded, slowly. Then I reached into my purse and took out a single envelope. Inside was a letter I had written the night before. It wasn't dramatic, just clear. I stated in plain language that I had finalized my estate, that Jason was no longer a beneficiary, that any future contact concerning financial matters would be directed to Lucinda or my appointed trustee. The letter also confirmed I had legally transferred oversight of my healthcare decisions to an independent medical proxy, someone with no financial stake in my life. Jason took the envelope and set it aside like it was junk mail, but Lila looked pale. I stayed another 10 minutes. Then I stood up, thanked them for the evening, and let myself out. The night air felt cooler than I expected, crisper. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and sat inside for a long moment before turning the key. There were no fireworks, no shouting, just a quiet unraveling. Sometimes the loudest decisions are the ones you don't explain. And that night, I made peace with silence, not as surrender but as closure. A month after that dinner, I hosted a small luncheon at my house, just 6 people. Lucinda Ms. Fernley, my neighbour Grace, an old colleague from the hospital named Myra, and 2 women from the Legal Aid Centre who had helped draft my trust. No speeches, no formalities, just shared dishes and quiet conversation. We sat in the sunroom light, pouring through the tall windows, and for the first time in a long time, I felt surrounded by clarity. Not family by blood, but by choice. People who had stood beside me not because they had to, but because they saw me, listened, believed. After dessert, I stepped into the living room and brought out a small walnut box. Inside were copies of the final trust, along with a letter I'd written for each guest. I handed them out one by one, not because I owed them anything, but because they had become part of the next chapter of my life. Each letter said the same thing in different words. That legacy is not about leaving behind what you own. It's about living out what you believe, and I believed in building something better than what I had inherited. A structure where trust could not be faked and love could not be weaponized. Later that evening, after everyone had left, I walked out to the old shed behind my house. I unlocked it for the first time in over a year. Inside was everything Carl and I had stored over the years. Boxes of old medical records tools, broken chairs we never got around to fixing. I cleared space on the back wall and hung a new frame. Inside it was a single page from my court file. The judge's ruling. I didn't frame it to celebrate, I framed it to remember. To remind myself that silence doesn't mean surrender, and age doesn't mean absence of strength. That moment in the courtroom was not a victory over Jason, it was a reclamation of my own name. 3 days later, I got a call from the district attorney's office. They were opening a formal investigation into the forged power of attorney. The handwriting expert was already on record. The bank fraud team had compiled reports. If pursued, Jason could face misdemeanor charges, maybe more. I thanked the woman on the phone and told her I understood. Then I sat with it. I didn't want revenge. What I wanted was the truth to be held up without apology. What happened mattered, even if no one went to prison over it. That night I made one more change to my documents. I added a clause that instructed my trustee to publish a short op-ed in the local paper upon my passing. It would simply state that my estate had been redirected to public service causes following a failed attempt at involuntary guardianship. I wasn't naming names, I wasn't airing laundry, I was stating facts. When Jason made his move, he expected me to be weak. He expected confusion, guilt, maybe even resignation. He never expected I'd respond with precision, with boundaries, and with dignity. He never imagined that the mother he tried to silence would end up speaking louder in her restraint than she ever had in words. As summer came in, I found myself waking up earlier, walking farther, listening to music again. Little shifts. Not everything heals, but some things become lighter with time. And sometimes the greatest act of defiance is not closing the door loudly. It's opening a new one and walking through without looking back. That fall, I joined a community discussion group at the local library. It wasn't anything grand, just a weekly circle of older women, some widowed, some divorced, some simply searching for voices that understood theirs. We met every Thursday afternoon. No agenda, just space to speak. The first time I showed up, I didn't say much. I listened. I watched the way women leaned forward when they were heard, how their eyes softened when someone else said something they had always felt but never put into words. There was something sacred in that quiet witnessing. By the third week, I shared a piece of my story. Not everything, just enough. I told them about the moment I realized silence could be armor, about the night I rewrote my will not out of anger but clarity, about how protecting what you build doesn't make you hard, it makes you whole. No one gasped, no one clapped, they just nodded, and that was enough. Around the same time, I received a letter from a woman I didn't know. Her name was Eleanor, and she'd been referred to me by Ms. Fernley. Her son, too, had attempted to claim guardianship. Unlike mine, her case hadn't gone to court yet. But the signs were there. Frozen accounts, missing medical files, a sense of being watched but never truly seen. She asked if we could meet. We sat together at a small diner just off Route 17. The coffee was weak, but the conversation was strong. I didn't tell her what to do. I just told her what I had done, what I wished I'd seen sooner, what I would never ignore again. At the end of that meal, she didn't look scared anymore, just steadier. When I got home that evening, I stood by my kitchen sink and thought about how easy it would have been to just disappear quietly, to fade into the background, like so many women are expected to do when they age. But instead, I'd drawn a line, not to divide, but to define. I hadn't become someone new. I had returned to myself. Later that week, Lucinda called. She had submitted an op-ed to a regional health policy journal discussing elder exploitation and the legal gaps in guardianship laws. She'd cited my case not by name, but by outline. The judge's ruling, the counter-evidence, the forensic documentation. It wasn't about revenge, it was about record. Stories like mine often vanish into sealed court files and quiet conversations. But not this time. Not anymore. That Sunday, I walked through the cemetery where Carl was buried. It had been a long time since I'd spoken out loud to the stone. But that afternoon I did. I told him everything. Not because I believed he could hear me, but because I needed to say it without flinching. I told him Jason had made his choice, and so had I. There was no poetry to it, no dramatic monologue, just a simple, steady voice returning to itself. I stayed until the wind turned cold. Then I placed a folded copy of the final estate document at the base of Carl's headstone. It wasn't for him. It was for me, a marker of what I had survived, what I had reclaimed, what would never be taken again. ChatGPT, Danoi, winter came quietly that year, not with storms or blizzards, just a slow hush that crept into the edges of each morning. I noticed the stillness more than ever, the way my porch steps didn't creak the same, the way the birds stopped coming to the feeder one by one. That's when the phone calls began again. Not from Jason, but from people around him. First, it was an old mutual acquaintance. Someone from the neighborhood association trying to make small talk, but clearly fishing for something. She mentioned that Jason had been struggling professionally. The merger fell through. His name had come up in a legal ethics complaint. I listened, nodded, and said I wished him well. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address. But I knew the handwriting. Jason's words were longer this time, carefully chosen as if rewritten a dozen times before reaching the page. He didn't ask for money. He didn't plead innocence. He just said he had been wrong, that he understood now what he had done, that the weight of his choices was heavier than he'd imagined. He wrote that he missed his father's voice, that sometimes when he drove alone at night, he thought about those years when we were still a family, and then right at the bottom, he said he didn't expect anything from me, only that I live the rest of my life knowing I had been right to draw the line. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just sat there reading it twice, then folded it and placed it in the back of a drawer. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something like quiet. The next morning I called Lucinda and told her I was ready to meet with the board of the new foundation. The community clinic Carl had always wanted to build his name would finally be attached to something alive. We'd spent months preparing. Licenses, staffing plans, mobile unit schedules, and now the final funding had been transferred. My house would be placed into the trust as a collateral asset, but I'd still live in it until the day I chose otherwise. At the first board meeting, I walked in with Carl's old leather briefcase, not because it had anything useful in it, just because it felt right. There were 6 of us, including a young nurse practitioner named Tessa, who reminded me of who I used to be at her age, hopeful, a little nervous, but grounded in purpose. I looked around the room and thought of all the energy I'd spent trying to fix Jason, all the years waiting for him to change. And I realized something. This was never about fixing a broken child. It was about refusing to break with him. I had chosen my boundaries not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I had chosen not to let pain write my ending. As I sat through that meeting, hearing reports and talking timelines, I felt something shift again. Not closure, but forward. Not freedom as escape, but freedom as return. Spring arrived earlier than usual. The cherry trees along my street bloomed soft and full, and the breeze carried the smell of cut grass and rain. Life moved forward in small ways. The clinic opened its doors to its first patients. I stopped setting my alarm. I found myself laughing more with Grace on our morning walks. The weight I had carried for so long of guilt, confusion, and hope misplaced had quietly slipped off. I had not disowned my son. I had simply stopped giving him the power to define me. Jason never called again after that letter, and that was all right. Some relationships don't end with an explosion. They dissolve thread by thread until only silence remains. And sometimes that silence is grace. I kept the briefcase on the chair by my front door. On the wall above it, I hung a photo from the clinic's opening day. Tessa stood beside the mobile unit, her eyes bright, sleeves rolled up, ready to serve. I saw in her what I had nearly lost in myself, that capacity to begin again. My mornings are simple now: coffee, a little music. Sometimes I sort through Carl's old papers and find his notes on rural healthcare written in the margins of yellowing files. He dreamed of building something lasting. I think he'd be proud we did it without noise, just persistence. The neighbors wave more now. A few know pieces of the story, but most just see an old woman who tends her porch flowers and hosts a book circle once a month. They don't see the courtroom, the betrayal, the strength it took to say no and mean it. And that's all right too. The truth is not always meant to be visible. Sometimes it lives in the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. One day, maybe years from now, Jason may walk past the clinic and recognize the name on the sign. Maybe he will stop. Maybe he won't. But I will not be waiting. I have already arrived. If you've ever had to stand your ground against someone you once trusted, know this: you are not alone. Sometimes protecting your peace means drawing the line that others refuse to see. If this story touched something in you, take a deep breath and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and someone else might need to hear it today.